What if you took normal Windows users, no programmers, no tech experts, and asked them to use Linux as their main operating system for 7 straight days? No Windows, no backups, no going back when things get uncomfortable. That's exactly what we did. Linux has a reputation. Some people think it's only for developers. Others think it's confusing, risky, or just not ready for everyday use. And for a long time, those concerns weren't completely wrong. But in 2026, things might finally be different. So instead of guessing, we ran a real experiment. We asked everyday Windows users, students, and office workers with zero Linux experience to switch to Linux for a full week. Same laptops, same daily tasks, just a different operating system. And what happened surprised everyone involved. Before the switch, most of them had the same concerns. Will my files work? Can I do my normal work? What if I get stuck and don't know what to do? These are the exact fears most Windows users have when they think about Linux. Day 1 started with installation, and this is where expectations were already challenged. Most people expected a complicated setup, something technical, something that could easily go wrong. Instead, the install process was simple. Click through, choose language, pick a drive, and wait. Wi-Fi worked right away, Bluetooth worked, displays worked. For most of them, Linux installed faster than Windows usually does. That alone caught them off guard. But first impressions don't tell the full story. The real test began once they actually started using the system for daily life. By the end of the first day, confusion set in. Where is everything? Why does the desktop look different? Why isn't Microsoft Office installed? This is where habits kick in. Windows users don't just use Windows, they're used to Windows. And breaking that muscle memory is harder than installing any operating system. Some participants felt uncomfortable. One almost gave up on the first day just because the layout felt unfamiliar. Not broken, just different. And that difference matters more than people realize. Still, they pushed through. By day 2, something interesting started to happen. Once the initial confusion faded, they began focusing less on what was missing and more on how the system actually felt. Linux felt fast. Apps opened quickly. System responded instantly. Fans stayed quiet. On older laptops, Linux felt lighter and smoother than Windows ever did on the same hardware. That surprised them more than anything else. One user said it felt like their laptop had come back to life. But speed alone isn't enough. People don't use computers just to admire performance. They use them to get work done. And that's where things got more complicated. Daily tasks like browsing the web, watching videos, checking email, and using social media worked perfectly. Chrome and Firefox behaved exactly as expected. YouTube, Netflix, and streaming services ran without issues. But office work raised real questions. LibreOffice replaced Microsoft Office, and while basic documents worked fine, some formatting differences caused frustration. Advanced Excel features didn't always translate perfectly. This wasn't a deal breaker, but it was noticeable. Linux wasn't failing. It just wasn't identical, and that distinction matters. At this point, the users were split. Some were impressed. Others were unsure. Nobody was fully convinced yet. And that's exactly where this experiment gets interesting, because the real results didn't come from the first 2 days. They came later when Linux stopped feeling new and started feeling normal. By day 3, Linux stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like a normal computer. And that's an important shift, because once the newness wears off, reality kicks in. This is where habits either break or they don't. Most users settled into a routine. They stopped thinking about the operating system and focused on what they needed to do. That's a good sign for any OS. For everyday productivity, Linux handled things well. Writing documents, editing PDFs, joining video calls, organizing files, and none of this caused serious problems. LibreOffice worked fine for basic tasks, and once users adjusted their expectations, frustration dropped. One user said something interesting. They realized most of their work didn't actually depend on Microsoft Office itself. It depended on getting work done, and Linux could do that. But not everything was smooth. Small differences kept reminding users they weren't on Windows. Keyboard shortcuts behaved slightly differently. Some familiar settings were in new places. Certain apps they used on Windows didn't have exact Linux versions. This wasn't a deal breaker, but it added friction. And friction matters when people are deciding whether to switch permanently. Gaming was the next big test. Most people still believe Linux can't handle games. That belief used to be true. But in 2026, the situation is very different. Using Steam and Proton, many popular games launched without much effort. Performance was close to Windows in most cases. Some games even ran smoother than expected. It shocked the gamers in the group. However, this wasn't a perfect win for Linux. Competitive online games caused problems. Anti-cheat systems blocked certain titles. And when a game didn't work, fixing it wasn't always simple. For casual gaming, Linux passed. For serious competitive gaming, Windows still had the advantage. And this is where honesty matters. Linux is better than people think, but it's not magic. It doesn't solve every problem for every user. Performance continued to impress across the week. Boot times were faster. Battery life improved on laptops. Background noise from fans was lower. The system stayed responsive, even with multiple apps open. On older hardware, the difference was dramatic. This is where Linux quietly wins. While Windows keeps raising system requirements, Linux keeps supporting machines that still work perfectly fine. That alone made some users seriously rethink their upgrade plans. Privacy also came up in conversation. Users noticed there were no pop-ups asking them to sign in, reminders to enable cloud syncing, no suggestions to connect everything to an account. Linux just worked and stayed out of the way. One user said it felt strange at first, but in a good way, like the computer belonged to them again. By day 5, frustration had mostly faded. People knew where things were. They stopped comparing Linux to Windows every minute. And once that mental shift happened, opinions started to change. Not everyone loved Linux, but nobody hated it anymore, and that's a big deal. The biggest takeaway so far wasn't about speed or features. It was about comfort. Once users stopped expecting Linux to behave exactly like Windows, they started judging it on its own terms. And on those terms, Linux did surprisingly well. By the end of the week, the question wasn't, can Linux work? It was, does Linux work for me? That answer turned out to be different for each person. By day 7, the experiment was over. And this is where the results became very clear. Not in benchmarks, not in charts, but in how people felt about using their computers. At the end of the week, we asked each person one simple question. Would you keep using Linux? The answers were not what most people expect. One user said yes completely. They were done with Windows. For them, Linux felt faster, cleaner, and less stressful. They didn't miss constant updates, pop-ups, or background activity. Their work got done, their laptop ran cooler, and nothing felt like it was spying on them. For that user, Linux wasn't just usable, it was better. Another user chose a middle path, dual boot, Linux for daily work, Windows for specific apps and a few games. They liked Linux, trusted it, but didn't want to fully let go of Windows yet. And that choice makes sense. It shows something important. Linux doesn't have to replace Windows overnight to win. It just has to earn a place on people's machines. The third user went back to Windows, but not because Linux failed. They went back because their workflow depended on specific Windows-only software in competitive gaming. Linux wasn't bad for them. It just wasn't the right fit yet. And that honesty matters. Because the real takeaway from this experiment isn't that Linux is perfect. It's that Linux is finally normal. 7 days was enough to break the biggest myth about Linux, that it's too hard, it's too risky, or too technical for regular users. It's not. Yes, there's a learning curve. Some things work differently, but so does every operating system. And once people give Linux real time, not just an hour or a day, it starts to feel familiar. That's the key. Most people who say Linux isn't ready have never truly lived with it. This experiment proved that Linux in 2026 is absolutely ready for everyday users, as long as expectations are realistic. If your work is web-based, document-focused, or creative in a general sense, Linux can handle it. If you care about speed, privacy, and getting more life out of older hardware, Linux has real advantages. If you rely heavily on Windows and Enlight tools or competitive gaming, Windows still makes sense, and that's okay. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about choice. For years, Windows felt like the only real option. Now, it's just one option among many. And that shift alone changes everything.